Greetings, players. It is I, your faithful dungeon master, game master, master of ceremonies, essentially your master, I guess. And I'm here to talk to you today about fate. I don't mean that universal force that makes a mockery of your pathetic notions of meaning and self-determination. No, I'm talking about Fate, the role-playing game, which will make a mockery of you in entirely different ways. I really should have like a theme song or something right now, like Jef Talks about role-playing stuff. I'll work on that. Anyway, so why a video? Well, we're coming up on session 0, right? That's the beginning of a new story arc. It's a time for cool collaborative stuff where we get together and talk about what sort of genre we want to play in, create the world, our characters, what kind of stories we want to explore, all that stuff, right? So rather than waste that time with a unidirectional, eye-glazing info dump about rules, I thought, why not create a video? So I am. So this is going to go into like an overview of some of the concepts of the game, not super in-depth in rules, but stuff that you need to know really before you go in to character creation, world creation, all that stuff. So you can watch this at your leisure and your eyes can glaze on your own damn time. So why did I choose Fate? Why am I here talking to you about this particular system? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, it's fairly popular in the grand scheme of things. It's not such an esoteric, niche sort of game that there's no chance you'll ever run across it again. It's also been around for a while and has been really influential to a lot of modern games. So for that reason, it's pretty much worth experiencing. Another major, more practical factor is that it would be advantageous for us to be able to learn one system, and if we like it, use it to play a lot of different games, especially in light of the whole creative explosion that happens in session 0. It would be good to have something that could handle whatever we threw at it. And Fate is one of those games. The reason is that it is a universal or generic system, or as they refer to it, a toolkit. It's not tied to a particular genre or setting. Like D&D is very much about heroic fantasy, Monster of the Week, about Monster of the Week shows, right? The Fate is setting agnostic. So the idea is you come to the table and you say, I want to play like big budget superheroes like Marvel movies, or low fantasy intrigue like Game of Thrones, or crime solving grandmothers like Murder, She Wrote, or fuck it, mash them up, superhero grandmothers fighting for the throne. Fate's like, cool, let's do it. Because it's a toolkit, it's very flexible. Another thing that's great about that flexibility is that it allows you to model nearly any character concept pretty easily. You want to play a cyborg gorilla? It's on the cover. If you want to play suburban cats that are secretly sacrificing mice to power their magic so that they can protect their human burdens from evil forces, yeah, there's literally a Fate setting book about that. And if you happen to be a player who comes to the table with a fully formed character idea, only to find that the system that you're using doesn't do that, so you try and make it fit, you make compromises. In the end, it's just kind of unsatisfying, right? Well, buckle up, kids, because it's time to get satisfied. So going into this, it's key to understand a couple of the key assumptions that Fate makes, even more so than understanding some of the actual mechanics of the game. First of all, Fate is a fiction-first game. Now, you've experienced this before with Monster of the Week. It essentially means two things, and these are so important to Fate that they are actually enshrined in the rules as the golden and silver rules. So the golden rule of Fate is decide what you're trying to accomplish first, then consult the rules to help you do it. All right? Don't let your worries about the rules limit your choices or creativity in the moment. Do cool stuff. Try neat things, narrate awesomeness, and we'll figure out how the rules can make that happen after the fact. The silver rule is a corollary of that. Never let the rules get in the way of what makes narrative sense. Sometimes it's best to just ignore a rule or mechanic, or apply a rule in a circumstance that you wouldn't normally. Now, that's not to say that the rules don't matter. Rules provide constraints, and constraints are important because they're interesting, but without them, there's no such thing as meaningful choice, right? So the silver rule is really saying is just that rule systems can't predict every circumstance. So do what you got to do with the rules, but maintain consistency in the story. Fiction first. Another really important thing to understand about Fate before you get into it is that Fate attempts to emulate fiction. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Duh, Jeff, it's a role-playing game. Like, it's all fiction. We're literally playing make-believe with each other. Okay, first of all, stow this ass. And second of all, what I mean is emulating fiction as opposed to emulating reality. You're not going to find a lot of details in the game about how things work in order to make them seem realistic. It's more about how things work in a story. Weapons are a really good example of this. In Fate Accelerated, Core, Condensed, you will not find a weapons table. There's nothing in there laying out the relative differences between, size, range, damage, number of rounds in a magazine. It's not there because Fate's not trying to model the real world like that. What Fate cares about is the purpose that weapons tend to serve in stories. And typically they're there to hurt, kill, or intimidate. That's not codified in the rules. That's just how you use them. For example, pulpy movies like Indiana Jones, they really don't differentiate. If you're on top of a tank, you can punch somebody who's got a pistol, whip. They all serve the same purpose. You're taking those bad guys out of the scene. So unless it's a signature weapon or a really important type of weapon, weapons mostly exist for narrative permission. Guns let you shoot. Whips will allow you to maybe swing from rafters or disarm. I'll get more into narrative permissions and touch on this whole fiction emulation thing again when we talk about aspects. Related to that idea of emulating fiction, Fate rewards drama. Now, Monster of the Week, one of the goals of the game, explicitly written in there, in the rules, is let's watch the characters kick ass, right? Fate is also like that. Characters tend to be competent and proactive, but they are also flawed. They have weaknesses, demons, problematic relationships, things like that. And Fate wants to explore both sides of the character. And it wants you to be an active participant in exploring both of those sides. You as a player bringing your weaknesses to the fore not only makes for great drama and a good story, it actually is rewarded mechanically in the game system. As a bit of an aside about the game versioning, I just want to mention that the current incarnation of Fate essentially has three flavors. There's Core, Condensed, and Accelerated. Now, don't worry, they're all Fate. They're all very intercompatible, but there are some differences in terminology, very small, and I just want to make you aware of those. Core is the oldest and most fully featured version of the game. Condensed is actually the most recent version of the game. It's essentially the same as Core. It was just rewritten to be less verbose, more of a Cliff Notes version of it. However, they did include a few minor changes to some elements that have caused confusion in Fate Core over the course of the past decade. And then there's Fate Accelerated. Fate Accelerated is a simplified version of Fate. It's really good for quick pick-up-and-play games. There's one major difference, though. Skills. Now, in Fate Core and Condensed, your characters will have a skill list. These are things like fight and drive and craft and all the things that you can do and how good you are at doing them. In Fate Accelerated, they replace skills with approaches, and it's just a set of 6 descriptors of how you tend to do things as opposed to how good you are at doing specific things. Skills and approaches are mechanically interchangeable. They work exactly the same way in the rules, so anytime I say skill or approach, they're the same thing. They're the same thing. All right, let's get into the game itself. We'll start with the easy stuff. These are concepts you've been exposed to. Let's see how Fate handles them. First of all, we'll start with the dice. Fate uses a particular type of dice known as Fate dice, or fudge dice if you're an old guy like me. These are 6-sided dice. They have 2 sides that have a minus sign on them. 2 of them are blank and 2 have a plus sign on them. And these are read as -1, 0, and +1. When you roll these dice, you're typically going to roll 4 of them together and add up those results. That will give you a range from -4 to +4. Now, when you want to attempt to do something in the game, you will usually start with a base of your either a skill or an approach. And these are rated 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 typically, depending on how good you are at that particular thing. And then you'll roll 4 dice, add it to that number. The result of that is referred to in the rules as effort. What you are looking to do is beat a specific target number. The target number is either going to be statically defined by the game master to sort of represent its difficulty, or in conflicts or contests, those are different types of situations where you're working against another person, either to do them harm or like in a foot race or something like that, that would be a contest. Both of those characters roll, and you compare the efforts of those to determine who has come out on top. Fate uses a non-binary outcome scheme. So if you roll below that target number, you will either fail or succeed, but with a major cost. If you tie, which is not uncommon given the pretty tight spread of possibilities, you will get a lesser version of the thing that you were going to do. And if you go over the target number, then you've succeeded. The amount that you succeed by often matters and is measured in shifts, which is simply the difference between your effort roll and the target number, or your effort roll and your opponent's effort roll in opposed conflicts. In things like conflicts, if you are attacking, for example, the number of shifts that you succeed by translates into damage or harm or stress to your opponent. In any situation, however, if you succeed by 3 shifts or more, you have succeeded with style. That means that you have not only gotten what you want, but there's usually some added benefit to it. Characters in Fate are made up of a few different types of elements. They are aspects, skills, stunts, stress and consequences, fate points and refresh, and maybe extras. Now, the cool thing about Fate, I keep saying the cool thing, one of the cool things about Fate, is the bronze rule. We went over the gold and silver rule. Well, it also has a bronze rule. Characters are made up of those things, right? Well, guess what? So is everything else. Everything in Fate can be defined, described, and treated mechanically using some combination of those same elements. And I mean bad guys, rooms, entire dungeons, items, vehicles, and even more esoteric things like organizations or situations, moods. Plot points, and even entire adventures might have some of these elements attached to them. I've already mentioned skills a couple of times, and I think they're pretty straightforward. They're essentially a measure of how good you are at certain things. These are typically rated from 0 to 4, and they'll take a sort of a pyramid shape that means that your character is going to be great at something, good at a few things, and even at worst, you're still going to be pretty competent. If you want a sense of what these numbers mean, there's an adjective ladder that they provide. Some people really love the adjectives. I personally can never keep mediocre, average, fair straight in my mind. They all are synonymous to me. At any rate, each flavor of Fate has a skill list, and they are not set in stone. You can alter them to represent the genre or the tone that you're trying to go for. Fate Accelerated, for example, replaces skills altogether with approaches, as I mentioned. And that game is really trying to focus on not what you're good at, but how you tend to do things. It's good for situations where characters all have the same sort of core competencies. Yeah, you're all hired killers, or you're all, starship crew. What matters is the way that your character expresses that. Aspects are the heart of Fate. Aspects are short phrases that describe something meaningful about your character or whatever it is that they're attached to. Now, the best aspects are double-edged. They're things that you could use to your benefit or might be used against you. Remember, Fate loves drama. Now, for an example, I'm going to reference an excellent write-up that was done using Fate Accelerated to describe play-by-play, blow-by-blow, how the Battle of New York in the Avengers movie would have played out if it were a Fate Accelerated game. I'll put the link somewhere for you guys. But this is one of the characters that shows up in that. If you look, he's got a couple of different types of aspects. He's got a high concept, which high concept represents your one-liner. If you had to describe your character in one line and that's it, this would be it. So they went with Asgardian, God of Thunder. Every character is going to have a trouble. Now, again, aspects should be double-edged, but some are going to get you into more trouble than others. And also, troubles are things that you think might be interesting to role play. Thor, legendary ego. Son of Odin would be a good relationship aspect, and then Mjiolnir and Righteous Warrior sort of round out his character. These are all things that are really important to this character. So let's talk about the aspects of aspects, right? There are essentially three things that aspects do. First of all, they flag what is important to this character. What is it that you want to explore? What are the sort of things you're going to want to do in the game? If it's fun, try and work it into an aspect. They also provide something very important called narrative permission. Magic would be a really good example of that. Most people can't do that. If you want a character that can use magic, you're going to have an aspect that gives them that permission, such as a steely-eyed necromancer or a scatterbrained alchemist. In terms of permission, Asgardian, the Asgardian part of God of Thunder, means that Thor at any time can pretty much call down that rainbow bridge. He gets access to Asgard. He's pretty durable as an Asgardian. But on even more mundane things, down street level stuff, like if you or I were trying to perform surgery on one of our friends, that would probably not go well. However, if you had, some sort of doctor-like aspect, that would allow you to make that attempt in a reasonable way, in a way that might actually make difference in the game. The third aspect, is that aspects provide mechanical benefits. And this is where fiction emulation comes in. Remember I said it was kind of like a nebulous concept? Here's the thing. Aspects are always true, but they're not always meaningful. For example, let's say I woke up one day and I was the God of Thunder. I would use that shit all the time. Wake up, take a shower. No, thunder shower. I'd make a bowl of cereal. I would go outside, call down lightning, just like raisin bran, just because I could. My life would be so metal. But in fiction, if a protagonist uses the same trick over and over and over to solve their problems, it gets boring. Thor is always the God of Thunder. It's always true. He's not calling down lightning to solve all of his problems. He's flying around, swinging his hammer, beating people up, and occasionally, lightning. That's cool. But there are moments when it's really critical and dramatic. Those are the times when he unleashes, like, God of Thunder. And those are the times you can tell in game terms that he is invoking that aspect to gain a mechanical benefit. Mechanically, aspects can be used in a couple of different ways. The most common way by far is the invocation. You invoke an aspect. In any situation where you are trying to do something and you rolled poorly, and an aspect you think would be able to help, you can invoke it or tag it. In most cases, you're going to spend a fate point, explain why the aspect is relevant to the situation, and then you get to either add a +2 to the roll that you made, or you just get to re-roll it altogether. So, for example, Thor is attempting to whack some mook into the next state, right? And he rolls poorly. Now, he might take that failure if it's not important, but if it is important enough, he could invoke Mjiolnir. Like, this was forged specifically for baddie bashing. I'm going to invoke a reroll, right? And that's it. That's all it takes. If you can justify it, then you can do it. Now, you can't spend more than one fate point to invoke the same aspect and the same action, right? But you can invoke as many aspects as you can afford and that makes sense, all right? So if he blew the next roll, even invoking Mjiolnir, he might then say, well, Righteous Warrior, I'm fighting a bad guy. Righteous Warrior definitely fits. Cool. You're not only limited to your own aspects. Like I said about the bronze rule, aspects are going to be everywhere. There will be situational aspects like a smoke-filled room or slippery floor, or even like an oppressive sense of hopelessness. Or maybe your friend gave a rousing speech. We'll get into how that works in a second. Those are things that you can invoke or tag and use them if they benefit you. You can also use aspects that your opponents have. All right, this is where that double-edged nature comes in again. If you use an aspect, if you invoke an aspect on another person in an attempt to do harm to them or use it against them, that is known as a hostile invoke. Right. So if you are fighting someone and they have a sprained ankle, or you're arguing with them and you happen to know that they're insecure about their appearance, right? That might be their trouble. It works exactly the same way. You pay the fate point, you get that +2 or a reroll. The only difference is with a hostile invocation, you are going to pay that fate point to the person you're doing the harm to. Right. So again, having weaknesses used against you will ultimately give you a currency that you can use in the future. Finally, aspects can be compelled. Compels are like hostile invokes in that you're using an aspect against someone. But the difference is that it is strictly narrative. You don't gain a mechanical benefit from a compel. What you do is complicate the situation for that person based on some aspect. Normally how this will look is a GM or another player, but let's assume it's me as the GM, is going to offer you a fate point and describe how some aspect would complicate things for your character in this situation. Now, you have the option to either accept that fate point and play along, or if you don't want that to happen, you would have to pay a fate point of your own to deny that compel, right? Compelling is very much a good faith sort of a thing. So if it is an inappropriate compel, or if it's just something done to exchange fate points, those can be vetoed by the game master or by the party, by the table. All right. Let me give you an example, though. All right. So let's say you're the barbarian. You managed to sneak into the gala without anyone noticing. But with your barbarian appetites aspect, I could definitely see you making a scene when that dainty little hors d'oeuvres tray comes by. Right? If you take that, then you're going to definitely blow your cover, whatever, you know. But if it's super important for you not to, then you would have to pay a fate point to whoever did the compel. So being compelled is a great way to earn fate points. It'll often be your trouble that's compelled, but sometimes, like if we look at like a Thor, let's see here, righteous warrior. That thing is going to get compelled constantly. Like, are you really just going to let that person die? That doesn't seem very righteous warrior of you, right? You can also, like I mentioned earlier, you can compel other players. You can compel NPCs if you know what their aspects are. And you can also self-compel. A lot of times, if you're just role-playing your trouble and you put yourself in a situation that's unnecessarily complicated because of that, like this is what my character would do, you can get a fate point for that. And sometimes even if you realize it like after the fact, wait a minute, in that scene, I definitely made things harder for all of us. Yeah, take a fate point, man. Play up those flaws and those of your comrades in interesting ways. Stunts are just fun. Unlike aspects, which have multiple ways that they can be used and involve a fate point economy and whatnot, stunts are simple. They are the cool little tricks or gadgets or techniques that set your character apart from others. They're things that your character is generally badass at on a regular basis. But they are also much more narrowly defined in terms of when they can be used. Now, stunts will generally do one of two things. They'll either give you a bonus or they will change the rules somehow. The simplest form in a particular situation, because you have a particular aspect, you can do a particular thing and you get a +2 bonus at it, right? Here's an example of that. Now, the rule-changing aspect of stunts is a little more nebulous. They will frequently allow you to substitute one skill in place of another, for example, using stealth to attack someone, which would normally be a fighting skill. Use stealth to attack someone as long as you're attacking them from in the shadows, things like that. Any game system that deals with you laying down the smackdown, laying out the smackdown, smacking down, has to ultimately deal with how the spec-down-y deals with the smackdown. Man, we got to workshop that one too. In Fate, that's sort of how you deal with harm is managed in stress and consequences. So as I mentioned earlier, damage is usually measured in shifts, right? And that is absorbed either by stress, these boxes, or consequences. If you are hit and you cannot absorb the shifts of damage dealt to you, you will be taken out of the scene. All right? First, stress boxes. In Fate Condensed, stress boxes act all kind of like hit points, right? When you get 3 shifts of damage, you mark off 3 little boxes. Now, these, like hit points, kind of not, don't represent health or injury or anything long-lasting, right? After any given conflict, any damage you've taken to stress is wiped away. Never carries over from scene to scene. So stress is actually a really good word for it. It is essentially plot armor. It's a way to absorb hits without taking real damage so that you get to see the characters, duking it out a little bit. Taking hits or shifts as stress represents luck or glancing blows or stress. Now, consequences, on the other hand, these are actually aspects, and these are aspects that represent harm, whether it is physical or mental or social or what have you. Fate doesn't necessarily, some versions of Fate make a difference between physical and mental stress. Fate Accelerated does not. But these are ways that you can absorb shifts of damage, but there's a cost, right? These are things that typically take time to recover from. And because they are aspects, they can be invoked against you. Actually, they can be invoked once for free, and, compelled, all those things, everything like a normal aspect could be. And you will have to go through, story efforts to get those resolved and healed. Now, I mentioned being taken out of the scene. What does that mean? It really depends a lot on the context. Essentially, there are 2 ways for you to lose a conflict. One of them is being taken out. Now, let's say all of your consequences have been filled up, you've got 2 stress boxes left, and you take a 3-shift hit. You can't absorb all of those, so you are taken out. And what that means is that I, as the game master, get to remove you from that scene in any way that I see fit and makes sense in the story, and it will usually be bad.
Right up your hairy...
The other way that you can leave a losing conflict is to concede. If you're overmatched, you see it coming, or if it's just not a battle that's worth, breaking a leg or getting stabbed through the kidneys over, concede. You give up, you retreat. Now, this is like being taken out in that you, as an individual character, are taken out of the scene. The difference is that you, first of all, get a fate point. The second thing is that you get to decide how you leave the scene. So, for example, if you're taken out at the end of in a combat, that might mean that you're beat up and dragged back to the enemy lair, where you awaken tied to a chair. If you concede in that same battle, maybe you manage to escape through a nearby window at the last minute. Point is, you cannot concede in place of being taken out. You have to still have some stress or consequences left, right? It's a sort of a preemptive thing to get out while you are still in one piece. I've already mentioned fate points a couple of times throughout the course of this video, and as you've no doubt gathered, they represent a form of currency that flows around the table and that you can use to power cool things. Now, the fate point economy tends to be one of the gamier aspects of this system. For as much as Fate is a fiction-first game, it really does still have some crunch to it. It's just that the gadgets that it gives you to play with it and interact with it as a game tend to manipulate story elements. They allow you to step back from your character a little and approach a situation as an author might from time to time. Some people really like the amount of control that gives them and as well as the tactical options that it provides. Other players who really value immersion in a character don't like being pulled out of the moment like that to make those sorts of decisions. So your mileage may vary. But let's talk about fate points and refresh. Like I said, we were going to from the beginning. Refresh is the minimum number of fate points you will start any given session with. This defaults to 3. Now, fate points carry over from session to session within the course of one story. So if you end a previous session with, say, 5 fate points, you will keep those. If, however, you end the previous session with 1, then you will start with the minimum of your refresh, so 3. One of the side effects that has is it discourages hoarding. Just don't hold on to those things, man. Get them out there. Do cool stuff with them. Refresh also has a direct relationship with stunts, oddly enough. You start off with a refresh of 3 by default, but you also start off with 3 stunts. You can trade points of refresh 1 for 1 to get additional stunts. I have a confession to make. I have had very mixed feelings about fate points for as long as I've known about this game. For me in particular, when I get into the game, it is hard for me to remember to use them or remember how to use them in the heat of play. And, for some people, and I was like this for a while, some people really stumble over the fact that you have to pay a fate point to use a character aspect that is supposedly always true. Like, is it true or isn't it? Like, why do I have to pay for that? Now, I hope I made that kind of clear when I was talking about the aspects thing, but it still ends up being a really big stumbling block. But I've come to the realization over the years that the fate point economy is really, really critical to the way this game works. First of all, as I mentioned before, it rewards you for being flawed. It rewards you for bringing those flaws into the story because those tend to be the things that make stories interesting and make characters interesting. And it actually makes play interesting because you're getting curveballs from all over the place, not just from the game master. It also emulates and reinforces a particular aspect of fiction, and that is the flow of ups and downs, right? In particular, you take the boxer on the ropes trope. Our hero's out there, he's facing off, and he's getting his ass handed to him. Everything seems to be going wrong. He looks out in the audience. Who's that guy that my girlfriend's hanging out with? This is awful. Everything is going wrong. So in game terms, that is really represented by that character getting hostile invokes, compels, getting these fate points, and then in that last section, spending those on all the different ways that he's gathered up, different aspects that are out there, and just boom, boom. Finally, the choice of when to spend fate points and the choice of when to concede or accept a compel, all of these elements really highlight the core question that this game asks. And that is, it's not about what you can do, what is worth doing? What is success in any given situation worth to your character? Just to gather up all the ways that I have mentioned fate points being used, here is how you can spend fate points. You can use them to invoke an aspect, compel an aspect on another character, refuse a compel, make assertions about the world. And I don't think I mentioned this, but sometimes for particularly powerful stunts, they will require you to pay a fate point to power them. You can earn them by accepting a compel, self-compelling, conceding conflicts. The last element that might make up a typical fate character is actually entirely optional in most cases. They're referred to as extras. Extras are things that are, well, they're little packages, like mini characters almost. They will be made up of some combination of the same character elements. They are often things that are too complicated to represent as a single aspect, or that they are important, but they're not core to your character. They might be things that you could lose. Good example would be a powerful magic item. A magical sword might have aspects of its own. It might have stunts tied to it. Extras can also represent things like sidekicks, or, going back to the whole thing about weapon damage not mattering, you can fix that. Some weapons can be modeled as extras. Maybe you want to do it that way. There are a number of different ways to do that, but that would be a viable way. You could have aspects, about range and ammunition and things like that. But again, these are things that are often not core to the character's identity. They might be able to be taken away or lost. Things like that are often well modeled as extras. They're not required because they're just kind of there to catch those really out there things that can't be modeled easily with the default tools. And this brings us at last to the 4 actions. Anything that a character does that requires rolling, is worth rolling for, Fate will put into one of 4 buckets, which they refer to as actions: attack, defend, overcome, or create an advantage. These are where rules interact with narration and dice rolls. It all kind of comes together in these actions. So, like other role-playing games, you're usually going to be doing like a lot of free-form role-playing and so forth. But also, like other games, when things get really, where there's a conflict, a challenge, or a contest, a lot of times those will go down to turns. On your turn, typically, you would be able to move and take an action. Now, that sounds familiar, right? Not surprisingly, in Fate, they are similar, but a lot more flexible, right? Let's talk about movement first. Movement means you can move from one zone to another. Well, zones are how Fate talks about space, when space matters. It is essentially an ambiguous but contiguous space in interior set pieces. Their rooms are a really good gauge, right? I'm in the living room. The dining room might be another zone. But it could also be, a hilltop versus the hillside versus the plains. Again, ambiguous, but they can generally be identified by certain characteristics. One is that any character can react and act with any other character or thing in their own zone without having to use a move. Move is strictly to move from one zone to another. So it defines space, but it can also be identified by aspects. For example, if you had a single room, one half of it, though, was enshrouded in magical darkness, and the other wasn't, that might qualify for having 2 separate zones. And in a similarly flexible fashion, actions might also represent anything from a single swing of a sword or a couple of tense moments trying to defuse a bomb, or let's say we have a character who is a swashbuckler. He's got an aspect, right, that says, I am a swashbuckler. That person's action might be to dive from the banister, swing from a chandelier, double backflip, and then drive their sword into the back of their opponent. They have narrative permission to do all that stuff from Swashbuckler, and if it's not interesting whether or not they nail the double backflip or not, you can pretty much just say, well, that's your action, because really what it comes down to, the core purpose of all that narration is an attack. So let's talk about attacks. Attacks are pretty straightforward. You are attacking if you are attempting to do harm or cause stress to another character in the scene with the express intent of taking them out or getting them to concede. Combat, perfect example. But it could also be an exchange of barbs or a debate. You want that person to run off in shame or what have you. You are attacking. The counterpoint to attack, obviously, is defend. These two always go together. Defend is a little bit strange in that it is not an action in terms of move plus action. It's free. Anytime you get attacked, you get to defend. Anytime you attack someone else, they get to defend. And defend is an action, though, like others in that it is a role that you make, and you get to decide what skill or approach to use for that role. For example, if a barbarian is bearing down on you with a battle axe, you might choose to, using approaches from Fate Accelerated, choose to dodge using quick, or you might choose to go full in with a shield using forceful, or you might be like, whoa, what's that? Trying to be clever and distract them so that their attack misses. So it gives you some flexibility, which is cool. Overcome is a very broadly used action. It is used to surmount an obstacle. That's pretty open, right? It might be in climbing over a wall or breaking out of handcuffs. You need to overcome those obstacles. It's kind of a catch-all if none of the other actions apply. And what you're doing, if none of the other actions apply, it's either going to be an overcome or it's really not worth rolling for. Another neat feature, though, is that it can be used to remove certain aspects from the scene. For example, if a thing is on fire, you might want to overcome that aspect by putting out the fire. That would remove that aspect if you were successful. Or in that previous scenario, with that deep magical darkness aspect, you might call down your holy light to try and overcome that darkness. So those are overcome actions. You use them a lot. But this brings us finally to my favorite, create an advantage. This, hands down, is the thing I love most about this game. It is the way that it makes non-combatants make all the difference in combat. It is the way that you can bring down a seemingly insurmountable foe. Essentially, when you create an advantage, what you're going to do is roll using a skill or approach to create an aspect that will be usable either by yourself or by others. All right. Bonus to that is that usually if you succeed, you will have a free invocation on that aspect as well as your other compatriots. All right. So this can represent anything from, throwing sand in someone's eyes. If you're not looking to attack them, just create I'm blinded aspect. That's how you do it. You could also use it for other sorts of distractions, momentary things like that. But you can also use it for much bigger things like researching an enemy's weakness, digging for an incriminating piece of evidence, or setting a room on fire to create that on fire aspect that we worked so hard to overcome earlier. Let me put it this way. Almost any non-direct damage spell in D&D, especially at least in the lower levels, I don't want to speak too broadly here, but almost any of those spells can be represented with this action if you had a magic permission, right? A lot of playbook moves from Monster of the Week and other Powered by the Apocalypse games can be represented with Create an Advantage. Now, the big difference is that in those other games, you have a list of things that you can choose from. Fate is much more open with it. As long as it suits your character, the story, and you have narrative permission to do it, yeah, go for it. It rewards creativity. It also really does a lot to create a sense of teamwork. You can have some characters, setting up advantages that other characters can, invoke those aspects and really just bring down the hammer on the opponents. So it's really cool. It's really cool. So that's pretty much it, what I'm going to talk about in this. There are a couple of smaller rules that I'm not going to get into. It's boring and easy enough to learn and play. Only two real things that I want to touch on briefly before we wrap this up. One, coming out of that 4 actions section, I want to tie things back around to the golden rule of Fate. That being, decide on what it is that you want to do, what you're trying to accomplish first, and then figure out how the rules can support that. Now that you've seen the 4 actions, you might have a better idea of why that's so important, because you might say, I'm going to attack, which would really be boring. Don't do that. Add some color to it, because it might actually turn out that what it is that you're doing rules-wise might turn out to be an overcome or create an advantage. Who knows? Don't worry about that in the front. All right. The last thing really is everything that I presented here is in terms of the vanilla Fate experience. Fate being a toolkit is, again, very flexible and modular, and there are so many what they call worlds of adventure. And I mentioned the Secrets of Cats earlier, but there are a slew of these things, and they will not only provide some background or, the fluff, as they call it, about the world that they're describing, but a lot of times they will include variations of rules, different things that they've pulled out, like for new skill lists, for example, specific stunts that would be appropriate for the genre, all kinds of different things. They can really mold that system, and they often do. So I just wanted you to know that they exist. A lot of them are real specific and weird in some cases, but they're cool. So that's pretty much it. I hope this was helpful, enlightening in some way, even if that enlightenment is, oh my God, this sounds awful. I do not want to play this. Good to know ahead of time. I'll just sell this video to Disney or something, and it'll all be worth it. So anyway, take it easy. Jef talks about role-playing stuff.